We are taught that David's biggest problem was a 9-foot giant named Goliath. We are wrong. Goliath was the easy part. Goliath was just a target. The real war didn't happen in the valley. It happened in the living room. It happened at the dinner table. It happened when his own blood looked at him and wished he would fail. Before David could cut off the head of the giant, he had to survive the knife in his back planted by his big brother. If you have ever felt rejected by the people who were supposed to protect you, this isn't just a story about a shepherd. This is your biography. Let's talk about the enemy sleeping in the next room. The war didn't start in the Valley of Elah with a giant screaming insults. It started years earlier, in a suffocating living room in Bethlehem, with a jar of oil and a shattered ego. When the prophet Samuel arrived at Jesse's house, Eliab, the firstborn, stood at the front of the line, chest puffed out. Just look at him. He was a specimen of masculine perfection. Tall, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed. He had the king look, and he knew it. He had spent his whole life preparing to be the patriarch, the leader, the hero. As Samuel raised the horn of oil, Eliab didn't just hope for the crown. He expected it. The universe was finally aligning with his ambition. This was his birthright. But then, the voice of God cut through the room like a cold blade. Do not look at his appearance, for I have rejected him. Rejected. That word hit Eliab like a closed fist. Imagine the heat rising in his neck. The oil didn't flow. Samuel walked past him, then past Abinadab, then Shammah. 7 sons, 7 public humiliations. The silence in that room wasn't holy. It was excruciating. It was the sound of a hierarchy collapsing. Eliab, the star of the family, was suddenly just a spectator in his own house. And then they dragged in the kid. The afterthought, the runt who smelled like wet wool and manure. David didn't look like a king. He looked like someone who needed a bath. And that's when the oil poured. It didn't drip. It soaked him. But stop looking at David. Don't look at the miracle. Look at the corner of the room. Look at the brother who was supposed to be king. Watch Eliab's face in the half-light. He isn't looking at Samuel. He is staring fixatedly at the golden oil running down the beard of the kid he used to boss around. He is watching the prophet bow to the shepherd. In that split second, something broke inside the firstborn. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a robbery. In Eliab's mind, David didn't just get blessed. He stole Eliab's destiny. That should have been me, his eyes screamed in the shadows. I did the training. I have the height. I have the seniority. Envy isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It's quiet. It festers in the dark like black mold. As David stood up, smelling of holy oil and future glory, Eliab stayed in the shadows, smelling of resentment. The dynamic was set. The brothers were now enemies. David thought his battle was out there, in the fields, against lions and bears. He didn't realize the first war had already started. Right there in his living room. The giant named Goliath was still years away. But a different giant was born that night. The giant of bitterness. And as we will see, this internal giant would try to kill David long before he ever picked up a stone. Eliab walked out of that room with a secret mission, to prove that the prophet was wrong, and that the runt was nothing but a fraud. The seed was planted. Now, it just needed the blood of a war to make it grow. While Eliab marched off to join King Saul's army, David was sent back to the silence of the hills. Look at the contrast. Eliab was living the dream. He wore the scarlet cloak. He strapped on the bronze greaves. He spent his days in formation drills, learning how to salute, how to polish a shield until it was a mirror, and how to look dangerous in a parade. He was surrounded by other men who looked like heroes. They drank wine by the fire, boasting about battles they hadn't fought yet. Eliab was perfecting the image of a warrior. He was building a resume based on the uniform he wore, convincing himself that looking the part was the same as being the part. He was a soldier of the parade ground, trained in the art of intimidation, but untested by the reality of blood. Cut to the wilderness. David had no audience. There was no applause when he threw a stone perfectly. There was no sergeant to pat him on the back. The wilderness is a cruel university. It grades you on a binary scale, survival or death. David wasn't learning how to march. He was learning how to kill. The shepherd label is deceptive. We imagine a boy with a flute. But in the Judean hills, a shepherd was a protector of assets in a hostile environment. David was the special forces unit of one. He learned the wind patterns. He learned to move without sound. He learned that in the wild, hesitation is a death sentence. God was stripping him of the need for human approval, teaching him that the only audience that matters is the one watching from the heavens. Then came the tests. Not a written exam, but a roar in the twilight. A lion. This wasn't a storybook illustration. This was 400 pounds of muscle and hunger launching itself at the flock. Describe the terror. The smell of the lion's rotten breath. The sound of a lamb's spine snapping. Most men would run. Eliab, in his shiny armor, probably would have called for backup. David ran toward the beast. He grabbed it by the mane. Think about the insanity of that. Hand-to-hand combat with an apex predator. He didn't have a sword. He had a club and adrenaline. He felt the hot blood on his hands. He felt the life leave the monster's eyes. He learned a secret that day. Monsters can bleed. And then, the bear. Different beast, same lesson. The bear is brute force. It doesn't stalk, it mauls. David was learning resilience. He was collecting scars that no one in his family knew about, while Eliab was collecting medals for attendance. David was collecting trauma and triumph in equal measure. These were the secret battles. God was training David in the dark, so he wouldn't break in the light. If David had gone to the academy with Eliab, he would have learned to trust in formations and chariots. He would have learned the Saul method of warfare, caution and armor. But in the wild, he learned the Yahweh method, total dependence and absolute aggression. This is the irony of the birthright. Eliab thought he was the leader because he stood in the front row of the army. But he was a hollow shell, an imposter in a metal suit. David, covered in dust and dried blood, unseen by his father and hated by his brother, was the deadliest weapon in Israel. He was being forged in the fire of obscurity. He didn't know it yet, but the lion and the bear were just sparring partners. They were the warm-up act. God was sharpening him for a much bigger target. And while Eliab was polishing his unused sword, David was practicing his aim. The stage was set. The poser and the predator were about to meet in the same valley. Years passed, and the inevitable war finally arrived. The Philistines gathered at Shoko, a sea of iron and violence, ready to crush Israel. King Saul blew the trumpets. Every able-bodied man was conscripted. Eliab, Abinadab, and Shema marched out with their chests high, the pride of Bethlehem. They were going to make a name for themselves. And David? He was sent back to the sheep. Even with the anointing oil on his head, to his father Jesse, he was still just the errand boy. The hierarchy hadn't shifted 1 inch. The future king of Israel was left behind to babysit livestock, while the real men went to do the work of nations. It was a stinging reminder. To his family, his encounter with God was a fluke. His place was in the pasture. Then came the day that changed history, disguised as a grocery run. Jesse called David in. Take this roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread, and take these 10 cheeses to the commander. Look at the indignity. David wasn't sent with a sword to join the ranks. He was sent with a snack basket. He was the Uber Eats of the ancient world. Jesse was worried about his investment, his 3 eldest sons. Bring back some token from them. Check if they are okay. Bring back proof they are heroes. David was being sent to witness the glory of the brother who hated him. He loaded the donkey, swallowing his pride. He left the wilderness, where he was a king, to go to the front lines where he was a servant. When David arrived at the perimeter of the camp, he expected to hear the clash of steel. He expected to smell blood and victory. Instead, he smelled fear. The air was stale with it. The army of the living God wasn't fighting. They were camping. Thousands of soldiers in full armor, sitting around fires, sharpening weapons they were too terrified to use. It was a surreal scene of paralysis. They were going through the motions, shouting the war cry, lining up in formation, but their eyes were dead. They were looking at the ground, not the enemy. David walked through the trenches, holding his basket of cheese, confused. Where is the battle? His mind must have asked. Where is the faith? And then he saw him, Eliab, the captain, the golden boy. But Eliab wasn't leading a charge. He was huddling in a trench, his face pale, his armor dusty but undented. This was the moment the illusion cracked. David saw his brother for what he really was, a terrified man in a metal costume. The imposter syndrome that Eliab felt deep down was now on public display. He wasn't a warrior. He was an actor. And the arrival of David, the little brother who had seen him at his best, was the worst thing that could happen. It was a witness to his shame. Eliab looked up and saw David standing there, fresh-faced and curious, and the shame turned instantly into rage. But before a word could be spoken, the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a footstep. A shadow fell across the valley floor, stretching long and dark over the Israelite camp. The chatter stopped. The cooking fires seemed to dim. From the other side of the ridge, a voice boomed, a voice so deep it vibrated in the chest cavities of the soldiers. Goliath. He stepped out, 6 cubits and a span of bronze and muscle. A human tank. And as he roared his daily challenge, David watched the heroes of Israel, including his big brother, shrink back like frightened children. The cheese fell from his hands. The delivery boy had just walked into a funeral. For 40 days, this had been the morning ritual. Goliath didn't just want to fight. He wanted a show. He understood psychological warfare better than any modern general. Every morning and every evening, he marched out to the edge of the valley, a safe distance, just close enough to be heard, just far enough to be untouchable. He recited his script. Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Note the insult. He didn't call them servants of God. He called them servants of Saul. He attacked their identity. And for 40 days, the army of Israel took the verbal beating. They stood there, fully armed, gripping swords they had no intention of using, listening to a pagan dismantle their manhood. It was a slow, grinding humiliation. David stood in the back, watching the reaction. This was the part that didn't make sense to his shepherd's brain. The Bible says when the men saw the man, they fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a panic, a collective flinch. Thousands of grown men, veterans of war, backing away because one man shouted. The paralysis was absolute. Fear is a contagion. It jumped from soldier to soldier like a virus until the entire line was infected. The silence of God in the camp was deafening. They had forgotten the ark. They were focused entirely on the giant. They were measuring the problem by their own height, not by their creator's. But David's eyes weren't fixed on the giant. They were fixed on Eliab. This is the moment the pedestal crumbled. For his entire life, David had looked up to Eliab. Eliab was the standard, the strength, the authority. But now, seeing him in the harsh light of the Valley of Elah, David saw the truth. Eliab was trembling. His knuckles were white on the hilt of his sword, but not from readiness, from terror. He was hiding behind his shield, trying to make himself small. The tall, handsome, arrogant brother was reduced to a shivering coward. It was a heartbreaking realization for David. This is what I wanted to be? This is the glory I was denied? The emperor had no clothes. The warrior had no courage, and Eliab felt eyes on him. He knew there is nothing more burning than the gaze of a witness when you are in a moment of shame. He looked over his shoulder and saw the runt watching him. He saw the confusion on David's face, that innocent, wide-eyed look that seemed to ask, "Why aren't you fighting, brother? Why are you scared?" It was unbearable. To be exposed as a fraud in front of the king is one thing. To be exposed in front of your little brother, the one you mocked, is a violence to the ego that a narcissist cannot handle. Eliab's fear of the giant was instantly replaced by a defensive, burning hatred for the witness. David broke the trance. He didn't whisper. He asked aloud, with a clarity that cut through the murmur of the cowards, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel?" It was a practical question, a transactional question, but to the men around him, it sounded like madness. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David reframed the narrative in one sentence. He changed the subject from giant versus man to idol versus God. And while the soldiers heard hope, Eliab heard an accusation. The kid wasn't just delivering cheese anymore. He was delivering a verdict on their cowardice. Eliab heard David's question, and he snapped. This wasn't the annoyance of a big brother. It was the wrath of an exposed man. He marched over to David, his armor clanking, his face red with a mix of desert heat and humiliation. "Why have you come down here?" he hissed. It wasn't a question. It was an eviction notice. "And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness?" Listen to the venom. Those few sheep. He weaponized David's humble job. He wanted to remind everyone within earshot. Don't listen to him. He's a nobody. He's a farm boy playing dress up. Eliab was trying to crush David's spirit back into the dirt where he believed it belonged. Then came the projection. "I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife. Pride? Eliab was the one who stood tall for the prophet Samuel, expecting a crown. Insolence? Eliab was the one defying the living God by cowering in a hole. He accused David of the exact sins that were rotting his own soul. This is the mechanism of the imposter syndrome. When you feel like a fraud, you attack anyone who is authentic. Eliab needed David to be just a curious kid so that Eliab could remain the responsible soldier. If David was right, Eliab was wrong. And Eliab's ego couldn't survive that math. David's response was the most mature moment of his young life. He didn't fight back. He didn't scream, "I was anointed, you fool." He didn't pull rank. He simply turned away. What have I done now? Is there not a cause? He looked at his brother and realized that the enemy wasn't just across the valley. The enemy was standing in front of him, wearing the same last name. David understood in that moment that you cannot win a war if you are fighting your own allies. He physically turned his back on Eliab's toxicity. He chose to ignore the voice of rejection so he could hear the voice of God. He stepped around the stumbling block of his brother's jealousy and kept walking toward the king's tent. The psychological damage of that moment shouldn't be underestimated. The person who should have been David's armor-bearer, his protector, his cheerleader, became his first adversary. Eliab tried to talk him out of his destiny. Go back to the sheep. Go back to being small. Go back to being invisible. It is the universal cry of the mediocre against the exceptional. But David had spent too much time in the wilderness with God to be defined by a man. He knew who he was. The lion had taught him more about courage than Eliab ever could. He walked away from the argument, leaving Eliab fuming in his trench, watching the runt walk toward a destiny that Eliab was too afraid to claim. King Saul was intrigued, but he was also a realist. He looked at David, a boy, ruddy, beautiful, unscarred, and saw a suicide mission. "You are not able to go against this Philistine," Saul said. It wasn't an insult. It was biology. Goliath has been a man of war since his youth. You are a youth." But David countered with his resume. Not a list of battles, but a list of bodies. The lion, the bear. He spoke with a terrifying calmness. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul, desperate and out of options, finally agreed. "Go, and the Lord be with you." But then Saul made a fatal mistake. He tried to help. "Here," Saul said, "take my armor." He placed his own heavy bronze helmet on David's head. He draped his massive coat of mail over David's shoulders. He strapped his royal sword to David's waist. Look at the image. David was drowning in bronze. He clanked when he moved. He could barely walk. It was ridiculous, but it was also symbolic. Saul was trying to turn David into a mini Saul. He was trying to fight a spiritual battle with carnal weapons. This was the same trap Eliab fell into, thinking that the uniform makes the soldier. Saul wanted David to look like a proper warrior, to fit the mold of what a hero looks like in the eyes of the world. David took a few steps and stopped. "I cannot walk with these," he said. "I have not tested them." This is the pivot point of the battle. David began to strip. He took off the helmet. He unbuckled the sword. He let the heavy coat of mail drop to the floor. Imagine the confusion in the tent. "What are you doing, boy? You're going out there naked?" No, David was rejecting the paralysis of tradition. He realized that Saul's armor didn't save Saul from fear, so why would it save David? He couldn't fight Goliath trying to be Saul. He couldn't fight the giant trying to be Eliab. He had to fight as David. He reached for his shepherd's bag. He picked up his staff a stick. He grabbed his sling a piece of leather. These were the tools of his trade, the tools of the wilderness. To the soldiers, they looked like toys. To David, they were extensions of his arm. He walked out of the tent wearing a simple tunic, defenseless by human standards, but armored in something invisible. He was declaring that his identity wasn't found in bronze or status, but in his history with God. He chose authenticity over appearance. He chose to be a lethal shepherd rather than a clumsy soldier. As he walked toward the brook to choose his stones, the contrast was absolute. Behind him, the army of Israel in full armor, shaking in fear. Ahead of him, the giant in full armor, boasting in pride. And in the middle, a boy with a stick. David stopped at the water's edge. He didn't pick up one stone. He picked up 5 smooth stones. Why 5? Was he expecting to miss? No. Theology tells us Goliath had 4 brothers. David wasn't just planning to take down the giant. He was ready to wipe out the entire bloodline if they showed up. He wasn't hoping for a miracle. He was prepared for a massacre. The walk down into the Valley of Elah is steep. As David descended, he left the safety of the ridge behind. Every step took him further from his people and closer to the monster. The acoustics of the valley played tricks on the mind. The wind howled through the rocks. The silence of the Israelite army was heavy. Thousands of men holding their breath, watching the sacrifice walk to the slaughter. Eliab was watching too, peeking over the ramparts, heart pounding. What was he hoping for? Did he want David to win? Or did a dark, twisted part of him want David to fail, just to prove that Eliab was right to be afraid? The complexity of that envy is nauseating. As David reached the flat ground, the scale of the threat became real. Goliath wasn't just tall, he was a mountain of violence. The sun glinted off his scale armor 5,000 shekels of bronze. The tip of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. He was a walking tank. The ground vibrated with his footsteps. Thud, thud. To a normal man, this is the moment the bladder empties. This is the moment instinct screams, run. But David wasn't looking at the armor. He was looking at the target. The wilderness had trained his eyes to find the weak spot on a moving wolf in the dark. He scanned the giant not with fear, but with the cold calculation of a hunter. Goliath saw him and laughed. A deep, guttural sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" The insult was deep. Goliath felt disrespected. He wanted a champion. He got a boy. He cursed David by his gods, Dagon and Baal. This shifted the battle from the physical to the spiritual. It was no longer Israel versus Philistia. It was the demonic realm versus the kingdom of light. Goliath triggered the curse. "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air." He opened his arms, exposing his chest, expecting the boy to run or faint. But David didn't flinch. He shouted back. And he didn't shout a curse. He shouted a prophecy. "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." His voice didn't crack. It rang out clear and sharp. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Note the audience. That all the earth may know. David wasn't just killing a giant. He was broadcasting a message to the nations. And he was sending a message back up the hill to Eliab. This is what faith looks like, brother. This is what you forgot. Then the impossible happened. David started to run, not away from the giant, toward him, hasting to the battle line. It was a move of pure aggression. It shocked Goliath. Giants are used to people backing away. Forward momentum confuses a bully. David reached into his bag. His fingers found the cold, smooth stone. A muscle memory took over. The sling began to spin. Whoosh, whoosh, the sound of judgment gaining speed. The entire destiny of a nation was now rotating in a piece of leather held by a teenager. The physics of a sling are terrifying. A stone released at the proper arc can reach speeds of over 100 miles per hour. It hits with the stopping power of a .45 caliber bullet. David didn't pray, "Lord, guide this stone." He had already prayed. Now he aimed. He released one side of the leather cord. The stone flew. It was invisible to the naked eye, just a blur of motion. Goliath, weighed down by heavy bronze, couldn't react. His helmet had no visor. His forehead was exposed, arrogant target. Crack. The sound was sickeningly loud. Bone shattering against stone. The rock didn't just hit him. It sank into his forehead. A frontal lobe was pulverized instantly. The lights went out. The giant didn't stagger. He didn't stumble. He fell forward, hard, like a tower collapsing, face first into the dirt. The crash of his armor sent a cloud of dust into the air. The silence that followed was absolute. No one breathed. The Philistines stood with their mouths open. The Israelites blinked, trying to process what they just saw. The invincible weapon of war had just been deactivated by a pebble. But David wasn't done. He knew the rule of the wild. Make sure it's dead. He didn't have a sword. So he ran to the fallen mountain. He climbed onto Goliath's back. He reached for the giant's own sword, a massive blade, heavy and sharp. He drew it from the sheath. The metallic swing broke the silence. He grabbed the hair of the enemy, and with a grunt of effort, he finished the job. He hacked through the neck. The head came free. David lifted it up, blood dripping onto the valley floor. A gruesome, violent trophy. This wasn't a PG-rated Sunday school moment. This was war. David stood on the corpse of the enemy, holding the head that had terrified a nation for 40 days. He looked at the Philistines. They broke. A spell of fear was shattered. They turned and ran screaming. The paralysis of Israel broke too. A roar went up from the trenches, the roar of men who suddenly found their courage because someone else led the way. They surged forward, chasing the fleeing enemy. But David stood still. He wasn't chasing foot soldiers. He had done what he came to do. He looked up at the ridge. He found the spot where his brothers were. He held the head high. This was the receipt. This was the proof. God doesn't need armor. He doesn't need height. He doesn't need the approval of the firstborn. He needs a heart that doesn't waver. The stone had killed Goliath, but the victory had killed the lie that Eliab had tried to plant in David's soul. The shepherd was the king. The servant was the savior. The battle was over, but the most important scene was yet to come. The Bible says David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but first he had to walk back through the camp. Imagine that walk. David, covered in dust and the giant's blood, carrying the massive sword in one hand and the severed head in the other. The soldiers who had mocked him were now bowing. The men who told him to go home were now chanting his name. He walked past Saul's tent. Saul asked, "Whose son is this youth?" A strange question. He knew him as the harp player, but he didn't know him as the killer. David had been reborn in their eyes, but David walked past the king. He was looking for someone else. He found the unit from Bethlehem. He found Eliab. The meeting was silent. Eliab stood there, safe, alive, but diminished. He looked at the head in David's hand. The head of the giant Eliab was too scared to fight. He looked at the sword. The sword Eliab wasn't strong enough to lift. The vindication was total. There was no, "I told you so." There didn't need to be. The reality was undeniable. The brother he had called arrogant had just saved his life. The brother he had rejected was the only reason Eliab wasn't a slave to the Philistines tonight. In that stare down, the family dynamic was incinerated. The birthright meant nothing. The height meant nothing. The firstborn status was irrelevant. God had chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and the weak things to shame the strong. Eliab had to swallow the bitterest pill of all. His little brother was greater than him. Not because David was better, but because David was available to God in a way Eliab refused to be. The jealousy that started in the living room with the oil ended in the valley with the blood. Eliab remained a footnote in history. David's brother. David became the history. David walked on. He had a destiny to fulfill. He had a throne to ascend to. But he carried a scar from that day that never fully healed. He learned that your enemies will be in front of you. Yes, but your harshest critics will often be behind you, in your own tent. He learned to trust God over blood. He learned that if God is for you, it doesn't matter who is against you, even if it's your own family. As the sun set on the Valley of Elah, the boy shepherd was gone. A warrior king had taken his place. The wilderness had graduated its student, and the giant slayer was born. The giant is dead. The head is buried. But here is the brutal truth we need to take home. You might be ready to fight your Goliath, but are you ready to ignore your Eliab? Goliaths are easy to spot. They stand in front of you and scream. But Eliabs are harder. They stand beside you. They share your last name. They know your history. They know exactly where to push to make you feel small. Maybe your Eliab is a parent who said you'd never make it. Maybe it's a friend who secretly hates your success. Or maybe the Eliab is in the mirror. Maybe you are the one telling yourself that you read just a shepherd and just a fraud. David didn't become king because he had the best armor. He became king because he learned to listen to God's voice louder than his brother's envy. Stop asking for permission from people who are paralyzed by fear. Stop trying to wear their armor. It doesn't fit you. Pick up your own stone. Walk into your own valley. If this channel helps you find the courage to fight the battles that actually matter, hit that subscribe button. We aren't here to entertain you. We are here to arm you. The giants are falling. Next week, we sharpen the sword again. Don't miss it.